Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for day 2 of our Sister District Summit. For those of you who were with us yesterday, I hope that you found the day as energizing and inspiring as I did. And for those of you just joining us today, welcome. I'm thrilled to see everyone. We've got a great turnout so far and excited to kick off the substantive programming for today. So I'm Gaby Goldstein. I'm one of our co-founders here, and I currently wear a couple of hats. I'm political director at the PAC on our electoral side, and also director of research at our affiliated C4, the Sister District Action Network. And I am joined here by Dr. Mallory Roman, our brilliant associate director of research. Together, we have a combined, 20 years of research expertise under our belts. My PhD is in health policy and Dr. Roman's PhD is in social psychology. So we're mixed methods researchers. That means that we love data and spreadsheets, all that quantitative stuff, but we also understand the value of interviews and deeper dives, all of that qualitative stuff. So we're really excited to be giving you all this presentation this morning. Next slide. Let's see. I think this is our breakout deck. No, I'm seeing the.
Oh, you are correct. Hold on. Let's share this one.
Yes, thank you. Perfect. All right, thanks everyone for bearing with us. Here we go, perfect. So quick agenda. First, I'll tell you just a little bit about SDAN and our programs. And then Dr. Roman is going to take us into the lab and give us some groundwork, some grounding in how to understand good research, how to read research, and how to understand findings that you might see out in the world, but all kinds of political research, but everything else as well. And then we'll take a deeper dive into what we know about the effectiveness of the field and fundraising tactics that we do here at Sister District. I know this is a topic that is on so many folks' minds. What works? What do we know about what works? And we should have some time for Q&A. Please feel free to put your questions into the chat as we go along. We'll answer based on time. We might not get to all of your questions, but we will be holding a breakout session directly after this session where we can discuss our research agenda, as well as we've created that space to talk about the 2020 election results and the analyses that we have published. So I hope you'll join us for that breakout if it is of interest. So next slide. Excellent. So Sister District Action Network is the 501c4 affiliate of the Sister District Project. So Sister District has it's sort of two sides of a coin. We do the electoral work where we endorse candidates and engage in our field and fundraising programs through the Sister District Project. And then we have our civic engagement and research work, which we conduct through SDAN. And so you'll see on this slide that some parts of our 4-pillar strategy that we talked about yesterday are housed at SDAN. We have these 3 general programs at SDAN, our flagship program, which is our research program, which we'll be talking about today, as well as our civic engagement program, where we work on those efforts to educate and empower, as we talked about yesterday, as well as the legislator and pipeline program, which we also talked about a little bit yesterday. But as I said, today we're really focused on the work coming out of the first, which is the original program at SDAN and really our flagship, which is our research program. Next slide. And so just to give you a quick sense of the types of research and the volume of studies that we conduct at SDAN, this slide shows the research areas that we work in. So voter registration, voter engagement, volunteer engagement, broader electoral studies that typically will use secondary research that we're not collecting, but we're analyzing after the fact, as well as the number of studies that we have conducted and reported since 2018. And I think hopefully you'll all agree we've really seen some remarkable growth year over year, and the expansion of the sophistication and complexity of the research studies that we're doing. Next slide. And we are a small shop here and collaborative in spirit and in training. So we welcome and seek out partnerships with researchers and other allies in the space to conduct our work. And so just as a few examples, over the past couple of years, we've partnered with Voter Participation Center on a number of studies related to voter registration. We have partnered with academics at the University of Michigan on some COVID-related research related to voting behavior during COVID. The Movement Cooperative, or TMC, is a frequent collaborator for us, who we are able to access their network of other researchers and develop our studies in that way. The Mississippi NAACP is an organization that we partnered with for some research in 2019. Researchers at Virginia Tech, we've worked on voter and volunteer engagement studies. The Analyst Institute, which is the premier progressive research organization. And I'm very, very proud to say that for 2 years running, our research at SDAN has been awarded an XB Award, which is the Analyst Institute's award for excellence in political research. And of course, finally, our sister district teams and affiliates. You are our most long-standing research collaborators, and we consider you our most treasured research partners. So with that, it's my pleasure to turn things over to Dr. Roman, who's going to take us into the lab and give us some tools and tips for understanding research, which will help all of us as we all work to understand what the most effective use of our volunteer time and energy is. So take it away, Mallory.
Awesome. I'm sorry I can't get rid of my background. I'm not zoomy enough, but I'm here and I will show you my bookshelf later. So today we are going to talk a little bit about how you might evaluate research that you come across in the wild. We get questions a lot about different research and if it's good research, and we just wanted to talk a little bit today about correlation versus causation. So this is something that probably a lot of folks have heard, especially if you've taken like a Psych 101 class, that correlation does not equal causation. Just because two things are correlated doesn't mean that one caused the other to happen. Correlation means that two things share some kind of relationship. A classic example is height and weight. If people are taller, they tend to weigh more. But there are also some examples of what we call spurious correlations, like ice cream and crime. So ice cream tends to sell more in the summer, and there's more crime in the summer. So those two things are correlated. They both go up at the same time, then they go down when that season's over. But just because they're correlated doesn't mean that people like go commit a crime and then they get a hankering for ice cream, right? Like that's not a causal relationship. So when we think about correlation, it's just two things that share a relationship. It might not be meaningful at all. Causation is something that is caused by some other thing. So a classic example of this is like medical research, where you take a pill that's supposed to decrease your blood pressure and it causes a decrease in your blood pressure. And so that is what we would consider a causal relationship. The way that you establish a causal relationship is by conducting an experiment. So there's a variety of types of research that you can do. Like Gaby mentioned, that we do broader electoral research using secondary sources. That is not experimental research. To be experimental research, you must manipulate something. We call this the independent variable. So in the studies that we run, this is like, did you get a postcard or not? Did we call you on the phone or not? Did we send you a voter registration form or not? That's the intervention. And then there has to be what we call a control group. So that's the or not group. That's the group that didn't get the postcard, the group that didn't get the text message. And so an experiment will manipulate something, and then it will directly compare the two groups that the only difference between these groups should be that one of them got the intervention and one of them did not. So this is a handy little chart that we have on our blog in our correlation and causation post. It essentially lists features of an experiment that you might evaluate and then tells you what you're looking for good research and what you should sort of read with caution. Not all research is perfect. And so we're not going to say like if it falls in the read with caution area that it's totally irrelevant. It's just that you should know that, these are the markers of good science. In terms of sampling, which is how you get people into your study, the people in your study are your sample. What we want is to have the sampling be as random as possible. A truly random sample means that every single person in the population you are trying to study has an equal chance of being in the study. And that is almost impossible most of the time, right? If you're studying American voters, you're studying Democrats, there's no possible way that every single American voter is going to have an equal chance of being in most studies. But you want it to be as random as possible. You want people to make as many attempts as possible to sort of have as random a sampling strategy as possible. So one thing that we do, for instance, is we often pick a district, and then we take all of the voters that meet criteria in that district, and then we pick a random sample of those voters. That's as random as possible. A non-random sample is one that it just exists, or is a convenient sample. So this is like a lot of research that comes out of like people who are doing research with undergraduate students who have to do it for their psychology class. That's a convenient sample. It's a group of people who volunteered, and there's no way of knowing if that group is generalizable beyond that group of people who volunteered. Assignment to conditions should be random. It's basically like a coin flip. There should be no systematic reason why people end up in one group or the other. If you see something where people are based on existing categories, like we're looking at the difference between men and women, we're looking at the difference between Democrats and Republicans, that is not randomly assigning to conditions. Or you should also consider if there are no conditions. So in some studies that people do, they don't hold out a control group. And in that case, you should read that with caution, because if you can't compare to a control group, then you cannot really know that there's a causal relationship. In addition to control groups, you can also use statistical controls. And this is essentially putting variables into the model that you think might account for what you're seeing or might contribute to what you're seeing in order to sort of extract their influence to leave what you're actually trying to look at behind. And so a good study will try to control for these potentially influential variables, including things like age, gender, race, your predicted turnout score, your partisanship. All of those things are known to contribute to your likelihood of voting. So it's important to statistically control for those. Studies that don't statistically control for these things may be showing inflated results that are really somewhat attributable to something else. Or they sometimes remove things in order to get significant results. And people will tell you that sometimes they'll say, like, we tried this and it didn't work, so we took it out and now it's significant. You should always read that with caution. And then statistics, it used to be convention that people would only report the p-value, but now it's convention that people should also report measurement of error, like standard deviation or standard error. The confidence interval, it's often a 95% confidence interval. It presents a range of values at which we think that this value really exists in the population. It's kind of a confusing concept, but it essentially shows you how good your estimate is. If it's good, then the range is small. If it's bad, the range is big. And then the effect size, which is essentially how influential this thing is, how big it is when it happens. So, like if I slap you in the face, are you going to get mad? Yes, that's a big effect size, right? So you should read it with caution if people are only reporting, for instance, a percentage change, like one group was 2% bigger than the other group, and they are not expressing what the p-value is, and they are not stating that it's statistically significant. In that case, you don't know if it's significant or not. In terms of conclusions, a good study does not make big, sweeping, or unsubstantiated conclusions about what happened as a result of that study. And causal conclusions should really be based on repeated experimental evidence. It should rarely be the case where people run one experiment and they say, this is the end, this is the word on this. That's rarely the case. You should read it with caution if a study does do that and essentially say that everything that happened in the data was attributable to what they did. or they make a conclusion that is based on a correlation instead of a causal relationship. And then just finally, limitations. Every study has limitations. A good study will tell you what its limitations are, and it will try to control for that in its analysis, or it will at least tell you what they are and how you might fix it in future research. But bad research often does not tell you what the limitations are, or it claims that there are no limitations, and that is a problem. There are always limitations. So we have a couple of examples here to just kind of like help people think through what we just went over. And so I'm just going to read them out and kind of go through them. Obviously, if you want to sort of play along, feel free to shout out in the chat. But the first one is a political organization that canvassed in the state legislative elections wants to measure the impact of their program in District 1. During Get Out the Vote, they canvassed 100% of the district. After the election, they found that turnout in the district had increased 10% from the last election. The group concludes that their program increased voter turnout in District 1 by 10%. So is this an experiment? It is not. It's not an experiment because there is no treatment. Everybody is being canvassed. There's no situation in which some people are being canvassed and some people aren't. And then there's no direct comparison between a control group and a treatment group, the group that got the treatment and the group that didn't. And those are two necessary conditions for an experiment. Is this correlation or causation? It's correlation. One thing happened in this district and another thing happened in this district at the same time. And that's all we know. We can't actually know if one thing led to the other thing. So here's a second scenario. 2020 state legislative campaign has money to send mailers to 10,000 voters in their district. The campaign makes a list of all the voters in that district who meet the criteria of being likely Democrats and also likely to turn out to vote. And they get 20,000 people, which is 10,000 more than they can send mailers to. So they randomly choose half of these voters to send a mailer to, encouraging them to vote for the candidate. For the other 10,000, they did not send a mailer. And then after the election, the campaign sees what the turnout rate was among the people who got postcards and the people who didn't get postcards. They find that it was higher at a statistically significant rate for folks who got postcards compared to folks who did not. The campaign concludes that the postcards did boost turnout. So is this an experiment? Yes, it is an experiment because they have an intervention. People either got a mailer or they didn't. And it compares two groups, a control group and an intervention and a treatment group. So in this case, the people who got the mailer and the people who didn't. And is this correlation or causation? This is how you establish causation. Basically, what we can assume here, because these people were randomly assigned to groups, is that there are no systematic differences between these two groups of 10,000 people, other than the fact that half of them got a mailer and the other half did not. So this can allow us to establish a causal relationship here. And I'm just going to throw it back to Dr. Goldstein to introduce us to our research recap.
Fantastic. And I see a bunch of great questions coming through the chat. We should have time to get to those, and as well as a few questions in the chat that I think we'll address in the remainder of this presentation. So huge thanks for all the great chatter in the chat. And Mallory, fantastic as always. I'm so grateful to you for your explanations, your expertise. I always learn something new when I hear you speak. And so I'm so grateful. So let's switch gears a little bit. We'll take off our lab coats and put back on our volunteer coats and talk about what we know about the effectiveness of the tactics that we use here at Sister District. Next slide. So I'm just going to say a few things at the top, and which are sort of top lines or takeaways or maybe take intos, as then Mallory will go into more detail and walk through each tactic individually and talk about what we know. So the first thing is actually a perfect follow on to something that Sandy just said in the chat, who is one of our fantastic captains in the Chicagoland area, where she said that there's a crisis of non-replicability in social science, meaning that you may get a result once and publish it, you may never get that result again. So that's really the first bullet that I have up here, which is that research is never finished. We never know for sure that something works or doesn't work. We have to keep trying trying, we have to replicate. And as you'll see later on, we have a number, we do a lot of replication studies. What that means is we try something, we run an experiment, it either works or it doesn't work, we run the same experiment again and again, because you have to be able to replicate it, those effects and those results, to really feel like you know something. Just getting it once doesn't count. I mean, it counts to some degree, but it's not irrefutable. So research is never finished, and we are, as SDAN and all good research programs, are always trying to get closer to what works and understand in a deeper way. But it's never just close the book and put the book on the shelf and now we know this thing. So another thing I wanted to sort of point out as we lead in is that a lot of the research that Mallory will be talking about, a lot of the findings show that the voter outreach tactics that we engage in here at Sister District are often more effective in quieter election contexts. So most effective in odd years, special elections, primaries, and we tend to see less of an effect for our tactics in the experimental work that we do in big, loud presidential years or those even years. The reason why is that there's a lot more going on in those even years. Voters are being hit with tons and tons of mailers, tons of ads, tons of postcards. And so being able to ferret out the effect of our particular intervention in those loud contexts is really hard. We have a much easier time running experiments and seeing results that we can really say that we have a really strong indication are, as Mallory mentioned, caused by our intervention, our work in those quieter election years, in election contexts. And another sort of big piece takeaway that I think is useful for folks to know is that particularly industry research tends to find that voter contact tactics are especially impactful closer to the election. So there's something that Mallory will probably talk about called decay, which is that the effect of what we do tends to decay over time. People forget our postcard, people forget the mailer, they throw something away, they forget the phone call. So hitting folks during that GOTV period is backed up by science. That is really an excellent time to hit folks with the information that you want to hit them with, because it's closer to the election. And that's a finding that is established in the research space. Another piece is how effective are these programs generally? These tactics, how effective are they? So industry studies, and I'll mention this in the next bullet point, but industry studies typically estimate that turnout effects based on these tactics are in the range of 0.2 to 3%. What that means is if you run a really good canvassing program, really, really good and high quality, and Mallory will talk about what it takes to be a good high quality program, you can expect that, if you do it really well, that can boost turnout an appreciable amount, up to maybe 3% at the outside if it's really, really good. But typically these sorts of field programs are trying to move the needle in a smaller range. So they're really most effective in purple districts, right? In places where it could really go either way, where it really does come down to a field margin. And this is the field margin, right? 2.2 percentage points can be all it takes. I mean, look at Shelley Simons, right? Look at Lori Pahutsky, right? 200 votes. Shay Roberts in Georgia, 350 votes, up to 3%. So it's important to keep in mind that these tactics are, we're never going to, through a phone banking program, increase turnout by 15%. Not going to happen. We're talking about the margins here. And at our level, especially, that often makes all the difference at the state ledge level. Another thing that I think is interesting, and this kind of goes to Sandy's point as well in a different way, is that on average, when we look at the research studies, and there's research that's done by academics and research that's done by industry. When we look at the academic studies that are published on phone banking and canvassing and text banking, these sorts of things, we tend to find that the academics report larger effects than the industry folks. Now, why is it the case? Mallory and I have been thinking about this for years now. We think that there's a few factors that probably help contribute to that. First is that academics probably they typically will run their studies in quieter elections, which, as we said in the first couple bullets, easier to see your effect in quieter elections. Industry folks are often paid in those loud presidential years, right? And so more likely that those industry studies in those loud environments are going to come up with a smaller effect. Academics are probably, using more random samples or more advanced techniques. And this, I think, goes to Sandy's point. There is a strong bias in academia towards publishing positive results. This is a publication bias that's well known in academic world. We've seen it up close and personal, and I'm sure many of you guys have also seen it. And so it's quite likely, quite possible that we're seeing academic studies that are published with larger effects than what we find in the field because they're cherry picking their results and really just publishing the ones that look really good. So that's another important piece. And then finally, I think this is important for volunteers to know. I think I find this very comforting and a great indication that we're putting our time in the right place. When we canvass the literature, both in academic and in industry work, what we see is that volunteer field efforts often outperform paid field efforts. Now, of course, not always, and what really matters is the quality. But if you have a high quality volunteer field program, it will typically outperform paying somebody to make phone calls or paying somebody to knock doors. And so I think that that's really an important takeaway for us all to realize that when we do high quality volunteer work, it's often better than that's exactly right. Robin Warner says, you cannot buy authenticity, right? And having a volunteer who actually cares, it typically comes through in the results. So those are just a few takeaways, things from across the tactics, across the research landscape. And now I'll turn it back to Dr. Roman to walk us through each tactic one by one and dive into a little bit more detail.
Awesome, great overview, Dr. Goldstein. Good. So canvassing is one that I'm sure we've all heard about and engaged in a little bit. It is when you go to someone's house to talk to a voter directly about voting, often for a specific candidate. To speak to Sandy's point about how important replicability is, you have to look at sort of the preponderance of evidence. Oftentimes we'll look at things like meta-analyses, which are sort of studies of studies. They look at all of the existing results and then they sort of say, well, on average across these studies, this is what's happening. So for instance, with canvassing, we know that canvassing increases voter turnout because it does it pretty reliably. In 44 out of 51 studies that Gerber and Green analyzed, they found that canvassing increased voter turnout by a statistically significant amount. Increases in turnout among people who are canvassed in one study that did sort of a meta-analysis of the 6 studies that they had done averaged 2.1% increase in turnout. And some voter registration studies have found an increase as much as 4.4%, which is quite large in this space. Canvassing is known to be the most effective volunteer tactic of the major 4 that Sister District engages in: canvassing, phone making, text banking, and handwritten postcarding and letter writing. But of course, canvassing is a little tricky because you have to be in person to do it. Canvassing effects can vary widely, and this is the case with almost all of the tactics that we talk about here based on election types. Gaby talked about quieter elections, election competitiveness. This sort of goes along with quieter elections because if your election's not that competitive, it's going to be quieter. Canvass timing. So for instance, I live in the South, and if I go knock on doors Sunday morning, I'm not going to talk to anybody. Canvass training and quality. It's really important for canvassers to be trained well, to be able to have an honest dialogue with folks. You can't actually talk to voters about the candidate if you don't know anything about the candidate, or if you're not familiar with local issues that the candidate is trying to champion. So it's important to have that good training. And it's also important to have quality. And so this means like actually training your phone makers, like Neil and I think the organizing department does a really good job at emphasizing how important it is to have really well-trained phone makers who are prepared to have quality conversations with folks on the phone. And that is when we get the biggest effect from these programs. And then again, contact rate, sort of similar to what I was talking about, trying to figure out the best times to reach your audience so that you can have the highest contact rate possible, because the more folks you talk to, the more folks you're going to be able to influence. The takeaways here are just canvassing is the most effective form of voter contact just because of that opportunity it affords for that real, genuine face-to-face connection. It reliably increases turnout. It might be a good voter reg tool. The quality affects the outcome. And again, it's the most effective. But as we know at sister districts, since most of us live hundreds or maybe even thousands of miles away from the candidates that we are trying to promote, and we're also, still in the middle of a pandemic in which I don't want to see strangers coming to my door. One of the best things that we can do then is phone banking. And this is when we call voters on the phone to have similar, authentic one-on-one conversations with them. When we look at the phone banking research, we generally see small to modest boosts in turnout, but it is important to point out that it is about 2 times more effective on average than the effects we see from postcarding and text messaging studies. And because of that, we think, and we have a lot of evidence that it is the most effective remote volunteer activity that our volunteers can engage in. The hallmarks for a good phone program appear to be that folks are unhurried. So for instance, a call center might have some kind of quota where folks are trying to talk to a certain amount of voters on the phone, but volunteers can take that time to really, talk to a voter about their concerns and make them feel heard. They're personal. They talk about that person's issues. My co-lead at North Carolina, Lacey, always says, what are your late night issues? What keeps you up at night? Like she tries to connect with people on that real level. And that allows for room for genuine dialogue, which is so important. So people want to feel like you actually care what you're saying, and that whatever they say to you is actually going to get back to the candidate, or it's going to mean something to someone who's involved with the campaign. And when we look at the difference between programs that are run well and programs that are bad, so hurried volunteers, poorly trained, not having genuine conversations, we see a huge difference in the efficacy of those programs. So 3 to 5% for quality programs and like 0.5% for poor quality programs. We know that robocalls are generally ineffective because of the things we just mentioned about authenticity and having an actual dialogue. And also one thing that's pretty common across most of these tactics is that warm contacts are better than cold contacts. Warm contacts are people who have opted in to hear from us. They've given us their phone number, whereas cold contacts are people that we have not, that we just have their phone number for some reason and we're calling them. So if you cannot canvass, phone banking is the next best thing that you can do. And like I said, it's the best choice for remote volunteers, which is the situation most of us are in. It can help boost voter turnout. The quality matters. And one really important thing, based on what Gaby was saying about decay earlier, is that once we phone bank folks and we identify them as supporters, it's important that we hit them again closer to election day and reactivate them during what we call the GOTV period, or the get out the vote period. So that's when we've set up our team and now we're putting them on the field during GOTV, right? And so one of the reasons why it's important to do phone banking early in the cycle is so that we can identify contacts and turn them into warm contacts, so identify supporters, turn them into warm contacts. So then when we come back at GOTV, they're expecting to hear from us and they want to hear from us. Text banking, I know we've all gotten so many text messages this year. Those are usually sent to voters by volunteers through some kind of third-party app like Hustle or Through Text, where you just can kind of click, and it sends a bunch of text messages very quickly. Estimates vary a great deal, so 0.2% to 3% across the studies that we've seen. But it's important to note that there's just not that much research out there on this. Unlike canvassing and phone banking, this tactic has not been used for decades, and so it doesn't have decades of research behind it. Voter registration targets might have some response to getting text messages when they get a link with a registration form. In one study, we saw a 0.3% higher rate of voter reg. Text messages also that are informational tend to be more effective. So things like providing voters polling places or information about the election itself. as opposed to plan making text messages, because we know that asking voters to make a plan works, but sort of having a back and forth dialogue with folks over text message really doesn't. People don't really want to respond to strangers, and they're more likely to opt out. And then once they opt out, we can't hit them again during GOTV when we actually need to mobilize them to get out the vote. And then just on a personal note, we ran a study in 2019 with the Mississippi NAACP with text messaging, and we did not find positive results in our study. There are a variety of reasons that might have been the case. It was a very specific sample. It was an off-year election or an odd-year election, but it's just important to note that not all studies find positive effects. And because of the file drawer problem that Gaby mentioned, where academics only report positive results, SDAN is committed to reporting all of our results. So if we did a study and it didn't come out or turn out the way we wanted it to, you're still going to see the results of that study. So takeaways here: the efficacy of text making just needs more research. There's evidence that it does have small effects on turnout and voter reg, and especially when you keep it informational. Again, warm contexts are better than cold, and requiring people to reply to you is just going to get them to opt out, and it's going to decrease your efficacy. So, and it's important to know that this research is being done to mobilize voters, not necessarily to mobilize volunteers. If you are texting volunteers to get them out to an event, feel free to do a back and forth kind of discussion. And then postcarding and letter writing is our last one of the major 4 tactics. This is when you send a handwritten or a partially handwritten communication to voters through the snail mail. We generally find a small positive turnout boost from GOTV postcarding, like get out the vote postcarding, and it ranges widely in the studies we've seen from about 0.1% to 1.4%. Vote Forward has done a couple studies with partially handwritten letters that have shown small positive boosts to special election turnout. Those are the ones that we've seen so far, but I think that they've done more research since then that just we haven't seen. But that's what we know about partially handwritten letters. And then SDAN ran 2 primary studies last year, and we got very positive effects in them. These are the largest postcarding effects that we've seen in any studies. They ranged from 1.25 to 2.17% in increasing turnout to the primaries. That is very significant in terms of effect size, and we plan to continue to look into that. We did run a GOTV study in 2018 where we wrote to voters in Michigan and Pennsylvania trying to get them out to vote. And we did not find any results in that study, but both of those samples were skewed in different ways, which could have affected results. And it's important to note that other studies doing GOTV postcarding have found significant results. So ours is not, the definitive word on anything. In terms of voter reg in postcarding and letter writing, SDAN has run a couple studies with VPC, a voter participation center, sending chaser postcards to folks who already have voter reg materials. And we have replicated that. We've essentially found about an effect of 0.2 to 0.3 in both of these studies pretty reliably. And then in 2020, we ran a head-to-head comparison of letters and postcards. We sent them to Chase voter registration materials as well. And we did not find that either postcards or letters boosted registration rates. And in fact, we actually found that they were slightly lower than control rates. And so that is an important study to take a peek at on our blog as well. So just takeaways here, sort of like text messaging, this just needs more research to know how effective it is. There is evidence that it has some small effects on voter turnout and voter reg. There is no current evidence that we are aware of that letters or postcards are more effective. The one study where we directly compared them did not reveal any differences. Postcarding appears to be more effective for us when we look at the studies that we've done at chasing another contact. So for instance, chasing a voter registration form, chasing a contact from a campaign, as opposed to just being on its own, just sending folks a postcard that's like, please vote, in a vacuum. Good targeting really matters. You want to make sure that you're talking to the right people. We've recently found out that postmark location might matter. So that's one of the reasons why we often ask you guys to send them to the state. And I know that that's like an extra shipping cost. So we wanted to substantiate whether or not that was necessary this year. We found that it might be. And we'd be happy to talk more about that in the breakout if you're interested. Like we said, this tactic might work better in primaries, and because of that, maybe in other types of quiet elections like specials. And we know that direct mailers, the content really matters. And so this may also apply to postcards and should be explored more. Then we just really wanted to quickly talk about a tactic that we call friend raising, which is basically just utilizing your existing social network. So people who you're friends with, people in your family, people that you interact with on a regular basis, to raise money, in our case, for political candidates. This is a form of what's called relational organizing, which is just utilizing your personal network to organize folks around doing some type of particular action. And we know that it's especially effective because people are more persuaded by people they know and like, and they're more likely to be able to be contacted by them, right? So when we contact voters, we may or may not have the right phone number, but you know your grandmother's phone number. The pilot study revealed that when you send specific messages, they're better than general messages. So when you say to folks, can you give me $10 by Tuesday? That's more effective than when you say, can you give me some money this summer? And friends performed better than HQ in terms of donation rate, which makes a lot of sense, right? I would be sad if I emailed 10 friends and I got a lower donation rate than an email from an organization that they belong to. So we still get really, great donation rates with our HQ emails as well. But just that personal contact, activating your own network, will get you, I think it was something like 50% was essentially our average contact rate or conversion rate. So that is huge. That no organization has a conversion rate of 50%. That would be just wild. And then we did a full study in 2020 that revealed that traditional candidate forward messaging is better than personal messaging. So that's also important to note. So just bottom line here, fundraising is effective. It has a high donation rate and it has a higher donation amount generally than contacts from organizations. So I'll kick it back to Dr. Goldstein and talk about our one-pagers.
Great. Thank you. So many great questions in the chat. Another plug to come to our breakout session where we can address many more questions than we can right now. But I did want to point out here on this slide, we have created one-pagers for each of the tactics that Mallory went through that provide both kind of overarching takeaways about what we know about each type of tactic, as well as details and citations, if that's your thing, to dig into more detail about the research and what we know. So sisterdistrict.com/research, you can find all of those one-pagers there. Next slide. So just a quick look ahead, we have a really robust research program planned for this year and next year. We have lots of new studies that we're planning, as well as replications of prior studies. Remember, we're really interested in replicating results. If you run a study one time and you find results, you might run it again and not find results. Other way may be true as well. You may run a study and not find anything, and then you run it again and you find something. So we do both. We're planning new studies as well as replication studies. We are really interested in voter education. This is something that we have worked on in the past and are going to continue to better understand how we can better educate voters. We are interested in continuing to expand the work that we do using existing data sets. So secondary research, that's not experimental research. That is research that will help us understand broader features of the political environment, like gerrymandering, for instance, as well as deeper dives into the 2020 election results. Please keep in mind, I hope everyone understands, the voter file has not come out yet for the 2020 election. So beware all hot takes about why certain things happened in the 2020 elections until we get that voter file. Continuing to deepen and expand our partnerships with academics and progressive partners and allies, and of course, all of you, as well as volunteer engagement. We have run a number of studies to help our organization understand how to help you all as leaders recruit new volunteers, keep the volunteers you have, move them up the ladder of engagement, and all of those sorts of volunteer engagement tactics. And then good good to keep in mind that this year is 2021, not 2019, but it is a quieter election year this year in Virginia. And as we mentioned earlier, quiet election years and environments are a really, really good opportunity to test tactics. Because it's quieter, we have a much better signal about whether what we're doing is actually having an effect. So, so that's what we've got. We have a few minutes for Q&A. So I've got some questions here, and please understand there are too many more questions than we can answer right now, but please do join us in our breakout, and we would love to talk about these in more detail. So Mallory, there was a question early on about what is a p-value. Can you give us a super quick understanding of why that's an important thing that we should be looking for when we see studies that are reporting results about political research?
Yeah, for sure. So I will try to do a very high level explanation of this. So the scientists in the crowd, please forgive me for the simplification I'm about to do. Everybody in your sample is on something called a curve. Oftentimes we talk about it as a normal curve, which is that one that's like a camel hump, you know, it's very even looking. Basically what we're looking at when we look at a p-value is, does it fall into such an extreme area of that curve that it is unlikely that it is a fluke? And so there's these little areas on the side of that curve that are known as sort of like the areas where you're within 5% of the end. And what we're looking for with the p-value is, does that value fall into that little place where it would be unlikely to fall into if it were not real? So all a p-value is essentially is a probability that your value is that the value you've obtained is a fluke, that it is not real and it doesn't indicate anything. And so when we have a benchmark of a p-value of 0.05, that is indicating 5%. There's a 5% chance that this might be a fluke. And then the smaller that value is, so if you want your p-value to be as small as possible, the smaller it is, the smaller your chances that it was a fluke.
Love it. Bottom line, you want to see a p-value that is reported at 0.05, that is the magic number, or lower. So 0.00001 is gold. That is what we really want, but we'll take up to 0.05. So if you see something that's reporting a p-value of like 0.2, that is not significant. Do not believe that the results there are actually finding any sort of causal relationship that you could hold on to. Okay, so another question is so I think this is the slide that that you showed, Mallory, around canvassing 100% of a district, and then you see that turnout went up 10% from the prior year. So the question is the previous election cycle, when the organization wasn't involved, considered a control group? Can you compare the results from year to year and learn anything from that?
Yeah, it's a great question. Unfortunately, no. A control group has to exist in the effort that you are conducting right now. So a variety of things might have happened since last year. Other organizations could have come into the space. There could have been more advertising from independent expenditure organizations. There could have been more competitive elections this year than there were last year. There could have been, the president might have been on the ballot this year, whereas last year they were not. So there are all sorts of reasons that you cannot just compare to a previous time when you weren't doing anything. Because the important thing about randomly assigning folks to conditions is that when you randomly assign folks to conditions, you can be sure that the only systematic difference between the people in your experiment is that they're either in this condition or they're in this condition. If you did not do that, then you cannot hone in on that being the only difference. There might be a variety of systematic differences that are unclear to you.
Yeah, exactly. Bottom line being, unfortunately, you really can't compare year to year or district to district or anything like that to understand tactics. It really has to be done in the context of a study that has held out a control group in the population that you're looking at. So there's also a question of, in relation to decay, does it apply to building name recognition earlier or repeated during the cycle? And I think relatedly, what's the impact of repeated voter contact throughout the year? Can that dampen the decay?
Yeah, absolutely. And that is one of the things that campaigns try to do. So every time they think you might have forgotten about them, they're like, hey, here's a mailer, we're still here. And so that is oftentimes how people do things. In terms of decay, especially our state ledge candidates need to be very cognizant of the fact that they always need to be building name recognition, right? Like they're not Joe Biden. We haven't known them for 40 years. And so those folks are going to have to do that earlier persuasion effort that tells people, that gets their name out there, and that will decay, but it's necessary to do that so that when people hear that repetition, eventually they're like, oh yeah, I know, Shelley Simons. I've totally heard of her before.
Absolutely. There are so many questions. We cannot get to them. We are actually over time. But please bring your questions to our breakout session. We would love to talk about them with you. And with that, I will turn things back over to Liz. Thank you so much, Dr. Roman. This has been a great session.
Amazing. Yes. Thank you, Doctors Goldstein and Roman.